And this is where we get into offers and negotiations. So if this is the first time you've joined us in this series, we talk about the 7-step seller service cycle. It's always fun to say that. 7-step seller service cycle. And what it is, step 1 is the lead conversion step, to convert that lead into somebody who's ready to meet with us. Step 2 is to generate a great pre-listing package of information and get it in their hands before we show up. Step 3 is to consult and have a great listing consultation that leads to a decision to hire us, right? And then step 4, which we talked about on Thursday last week, is really about doing all the things that really create urgency and create more exposure. I asked to think about the housing market a little bit more like an auction than a retail environment. In a retail environment where the price isn't really negotiable, you're either willing to buy it or you're not willing to buy it, but there's not really any negotiation. And if the seller can't sell at that price, then the seller has the prerogative to lower the price to where the market would buy. But the buyer doesn't have much sway in that, right? As opposed to more of an auction market, which is a bidding market. And in a bidding market, the price that you list something for is just part of a whole strategy of how can I create excitement so that people want to bid, and that people are willing to are afraid of losing this at this price. And we talked about how to do that last time. And now we're going to move on, because what we talked about was, if you do a great job, which I know you will, if you do a great job with marketing and getting the property position in the marketplace right, you get the exposure great, you've got a great turnout, you've got lots of urgency, buyers are ready to negotiate. If you do a good job, what you should expect, and I showed you the right pricing slides, I think, last time. Did I show you guys this, or was that a different group I was teaching last week? Did I show you Jeff Otto's right pricing slides? Can somebody who was here last Thursday?
Yes.
You did. Good. I'm glad. Because what that really says empirically is, look, this is not opinion. This is actually crunching the data on thousands and thousands and thousands of New Jersey transactions. And what we know consistently is, if you get it right, you should expect to be off the market in 3 to 4 weeks. And if you're not off the market in 3 to 4 weeks, things start to really go south. And so what we really try to do is make sure that we position the home properly. And if you've done that, you should expect to get offers quickly, right? And so now we're going to talk a little bit about, how do you handle those offers? What's best practice? If you were with us in the Win with Buyers series that we did last month, we kind of talked about how to write the offer, position the offer, and structure the offer so that your buyer has a better chance of getting that offer accepted. What we're going to look at today is, when you're representing the seller, what's best practice in terms of thinking about how to approach offers. So let's start with this idea that real estate negotiations are a lot different than a lot of other kinds of negotiations. And it's one of the founding principles in our company. If anyone is familiar with that crazy word that is probably on the wall of your market center somewhere, that begins with a Y, for, and then C's and T's and all that stuff. And the phrase that we call it is the Y, 4 C's, 2 T's. It's our founding belief system, right? And the W in the first part of that, the W is win-win. You know, everything we do has got to be a win for everybody, or it's just not something we want to participate in. Everything that we do in terms of the way we negotiate has to be to find a win-win. And that isn't the way that people tend to negotiate. A lot of times people believe that good negotiators are pit bulls, that they go in there and they're strong and they rip out your throat and they're going to win at your expense. And that just doesn't work in real estate. You know, it doesn't work well anywhere. If you want to see a classic example of how win-lose negotiation works, just get in your car and just get on Route 95 South and just keep going until you get to the Beltway, and then stop when you get to the Capitol building in Washington and take a look at what happens when people fail to find a way to negotiate in a way that people can all win. It just creates problems. And so it's a founding principle that what we're trying to do is find a win for everybody. Because if we don't, you know, here's the truth about real estate deals. If a buyer and a seller are not happy, this deal isn't going to close. And oh, Julie just threw up in the chat room the Y4C2T's picture. So thank you for that, Julie. You know, it's not going to close if people aren't happy. And if it does get forced to close and people are unhappy, believe me, the damage that that will do to your reputation, the damage that that will do in terms of the negative reviews that will come, it's just not worth it. So win-win or no deal is the founding principle. And so what we got to think about is, how do I expand the opportunities to find more common ground? And we're going to talk about some strategies today. So for starters, let's talk about presenting the offer. Let's talk about when you get an offer coming in, what's best practice? Let's talk a little bit about multiple offers and lowball offers and how we'd handle those. For starters, best practice around presenting the offer is how quickly from the time that you receive an offer in your hands. And again, remember, I said last time when we did Win with Buyers that if you're a buyer's agent, I firmly believe that if you can negotiate in person, I'm going to encourage you to try to do that. And I know that there's a lot of blowback on that in the real estate, the way that we practice it today. But I firmly believe that if you can get people face-to-face in a room talking to each other, you will have a far better outcome than if you do it back and forth through digital medium. That's just my opinion. But when you get the offer, kind of best practice says, look, we've got to present all the offers as quickly as possible. And I put in caps all of the offers because I still find too frequently in our industry, agents kind of act as gatekeepers. And they kind of give feedback and they comment on the offers and they critique the offers before they've ever presented them. And sometimes they'll even say, look, I'm not presenting that until you come back with something stronger. You know, we can't do that, right? We have to present all the offers as they come. Now, I will tell you, I used to do some work with banks and REO properties, and it was not uncommon for some of the banks that I worked with to make a condition of their listing that they required that we put in the agent's notes that all offers had to meet a minimum threshold of 80% of the asking price, or they authorized me not to present them. I think there can be some conditions that you can structure like that with your principal can guide you that way. However, we present all offers as quickly as possible to your seller, and don't give feedback, right? Never give feedback without getting the consent of your seller first, right? Hey, you know what? This is not a reasonable offer. This is not strong enough. You're going to have to do, just zip it, right? We're going to give feedback at some point. Our job is to take the offer, to be gracious that we've gotten the offer, and to present it, right? Be enthusiastic. Be non-judgmental, right? And we're going to talk more about that when it comes to low balls. But you know what? Here's the thing. Anytime that somebody has cared enough to step forward and present an offer, I think we need to be grateful. And we need to be gracious. And remember, when you're putting your buyer's agent hat on, that as a fiduciary, sometimes you're being asked to present offers that you know may not be the way that you wish they were, right? That they may not be strong enough, or they may have conditions in them that you wish weren't there. And yet, as a fiduciary, we present those offers anyway. So when you get them, be gracious, be enthusiastic, be non-judgmental. All offers and responses should be in writing, right? Let me ask you guys a question, and anybody can unmute on this. Are verbal contracts in the state of New Jersey legal? You can either throw it in chat or unmute. What do you think? Are verbal contracts legal?
Well, if no one contests it, then it's fine. But if someone says, well, yeah, you said, and they're contesting it, then if it's not in writing, then you got nothing to stand on.
Spot on, my friend Chris. So you're right. Verbal contracts are perfectly legal. I can sell my car to my brother and not have a written document to require that. They're perfectly legal. The challenge is they're not legally enforceable. And so if I was to say to my brother, hey, give me $10,000, I'll give you my car, and my brother gives me $10,000 and I take his money and I say, God, you are just as stupid as you always were. I can't believe you gave me this money. You're not getting my car, you idiot. Go tell mom, I dare you, right? There's nothing that the courts can do to enforce that, right? Because it's not in writing. And so really the best practice is, a lot of times agents will ask you to float an idea. You know what? Can you just test the waters? Can you float this past your sellers? See what they think. Try to avoid that, right? Really what you're looking for is all offers in writing. And all responses in writing as well, right? Because the counter offers and all the responses that go back and forth, again, without it being documented, it's not enforceable. So make sure that you have a paper trail. Okay. Make sure that the offer contains some critical elements, right? We want to make sure that the offer price is there, the earnest money and the down payment are there. And let's talk about those for a second, because I think they're really important. When you take offers, or when you're writing offers, as a buyer's agent, are you collecting an earnest money check of some sort at the time of writing and submitting that offer to the other party, or does that typically wait until later? What's the current practice right now in your marketplace? Anybody? Because it used to be that we always took $1,000 retainer check. And at the time we wrote the offer, we took $1,000. Typically at that time, it was made payable to the broker's escrow account. And we submitted that along with the contract to say, look, here is good faith. We've got money on the table. They're serious. They're motivated, whatever we said. It's one of the ways that consideration makes the contract, again, legally binding. And through the years, what's happened is in certain markets, agents have kind of moved away from taking that initial check, and they wait for that money to go to the attorney's escrow account instead of the broker's. And it usually happens sometime after the contract is accepted. And the reasons for that, without getting too deep into the weeds, is, the Real Estate Commission kind of felt a number of years ago that brokers were too laxed with allowing their agents to not turn those checks in quickly enough, walk around with those checks in their manila folders, and if an offer didn't get accepted, they just hang on to the check and use it on another contract later on. And they really put the screws to the brokers and said, look, here's what's going to happen. If we see this as an ongoing pattern in your office, we're not going to just fine your agent. We're going to suspend their license. Oh, and by the way, because they're working under your supervision as a broker, we're not only going to suspend your agent's license, we're going to suspend your broker's license. And once we do that, then every agent in your office can't work anymore. So either fix this problem or do, what are you going to do about it? And that's the point that most of the brokers in New Jersey said, we just won't touch the money anymore. Let's just have the money go directly to the attorney. And yet, that escrow money there should be something there. And there should be the down payment, which is divided into two parts, the initial down payment and the money that's brought at closing. You really want to make sure that there's a significant down payment on the front end. Why is that so important? Why would it be more important for your seller, now we're representing the seller, to see some real cash on the table in the beginning of the transaction? How does that protect them? Anybody? Got everybody muted here, I think. So try to unmute if you have some thoughts around that. I'd love to hear.
Maybe it's just so they don't waste time, like saying, okay, yeah, we have this tentative buyer, but they're not really that serious, or it's like they don't really have the money, and now you've just wasted time with that.
Well, it could be a measure of how serious they are, but it is a measure of how serious. So here's what happens. The initial down payment, right, which is a combination of the escrow that you took at the earnest money deposit that you took when writing the contract, and some portion of the total cash, right? If we think about an 80-20 loan, 20% of the money is coming from the buyer, 80% is coming from the lender. That 20% gets divided, some of it as an initial deposit, some of it is cash at the closing table. The bigger the initial deposit, the greater the assurance that the buyer won't breach the contract. Why? Because if the buyer breaches the contract, there's plenty of places where the contract can end. If the lender doesn't provide financing, if the buyer loses their job, if there's inspection issues that come up and it can't be resolved, there's lots of different ways that the contract can terminate. And the buyer gets that down payment money back. However, if the buyer breaches the contract, which means they just totally flake out and they break the contract and there's no legal reason to do it, then that money gets frozen. And it's used as a fund to pay any damages that the seller incurred. And so when you think about that, let's just run a scenario. Let's say I'm selling my house for $500,000, and a buyer has given me $500,000, and they put $10,000 in escrow. If they breach the contract, That money gets frozen. I got to put my house back on the market again, sell it again, go all the way to the closing table before a damage determination can be made. If I put my house back on the market and I get an offer for $550,000 and we close 60 days later, did I experience any damages? The original offer that was breached was 500. The new offer that closed was 550. Did I have damages? Anybody?
No, not really.
Not really. I made 50 grand. That's a win, right? Woohoo. And so in that instances, then the buyer's deposit money comes back to them. But if I put my house back on the market again and the best offer I got was 475 and I closed on a 475, did I have damages? Sure I did. The damages were the difference in the offer, $25,000, plus how much longer did I have to carry that property past my original closing date? I had to go back on the market. I was on the market for 3 more months. It took me 60 days more after that. That was 5 more months than I intended. That's 5 more mortgage payments I didn't need to make. That's 5 months of property insurance I didn't need to pay. All of that stuff gets rolled into a damage claim. And if there's only $10,000 in escrow, there's not enough bucket in that bucket to pay me, which means I get to keep the $10,000. But the damages are in excess of $25,000, $30,000, $35,000, which means I got to take you to court and sue you for the rest of it. And that's just complicated. It's time consuming. The lawyer's going to take a big chunk of that. When you're representing the seller, you want to make sure that the amount of money that they're putting into the escrow account at the beginning of the transaction is big enough that if they flaked out and they breach the contract, that there's enough money there to cover any potential damages that your seller experiences. And so you want to make sure that that's not all back-ended money. Make sure that money's coming in on the front end. Does that make sense? We kind of follow the logic in that. Other things you want to make sure that the offer contains: the terms of financing or cash. You know, what kind of financing rather is it going to be? Is it going to be conventional financing? Is it going to be VA financing, FHA financing? What are the changing conditions now in terms of financing that, especially in a COVID environment? Where does this person work? You know, are they working in an industry that is likely to be subject to furloughs with this pandemic? Are they working as an essential worker and less likely to be injured in that way? If there's a cash payment, is that money accessible, right? Where is that money? Is it liquid? Is this buyer the only person who has a claim on that money? Just a sidebar. I hope that we're representing buyers and just having these conversations about wire fraud and cash transfers. I can share just an awful situation that happened in one of our Bergen County offices where a full cash buyer wired all of his funds, $560,000, thinking he was sending it to his attorney, and he wired it offshore. It's gone. $500,000 gone. So please be making sure that we're having those wire fraud conversations. But make sure that the terms are clear. Make sure that the terms don't change. I have seen deals fail because a buyer chose to submit an offer saying that they were going to go with conventional financing and then actually applied for something that was not conventional financing and never had the attorneys make the modification. And that's a breach of contract. And it's a reason why the parties could, if they chose to, the seller could terminate the deal. Right. Other things, key timelines and deadlines, including commitments and closing dates, right? We want to make sure that those things are all clear, that we know what those are and that they're realistic, right? Any additional items included, any contingencies that the buyer wants addressed, it should all be spelled out. Sometimes what happens is a buyer and a buyer's agent have something that they think is going to be a little bit itchy, and it's not going to be something that you're going to agree to easily. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait until attorney review and let the lawyers address that. Don't do that. Because what you've done then is you've presented to your sellers an offer that you think is one thing, and then you get into attorney review and then they change the rules, right? And you know, the violation of trust in the very beginning of that buyer-seller relationship is not a good place to begin that relationship. And so anything that the buyers want addressed, we need to make sure it's in that contract so that the seller can actually properly review it, make decisions on it, and not get blindsided in attorney review. And so we've got to ask, is there anything else that's not included in this contract that might come up in attorney review that we should know about, right? We need to do that. Now, the other thing that I would throw in, where I said any additional items included, I'm not a fan of including personal property items in the contract of sale. And sometimes people will put in the other conditions or whatever it is that the seller is going to leave the dishwasher, the washer and dryer or something like that. Personal property should be handled as a separate bill of sale, right? And because what you don't want to have happen is you don't want the whole contract of the purchase sale of the home jeopardized because of some stupid washing machine, right? Put that, if you want that stuff, then include that stuff on a separate bill of sale, but don't include it in the sales contract. It's just a place where these deals can get too complicated, right? Which leads us to rule number one, negotiating rule number one: be committed to the process. Don't be emotionally attached to the outcome. And there's a saying that I believe in that says, whoever has the most to lose always loses. We talked about this idea if you were with us in the Win with Buyer series. But can anybody tell me why it's true, and it is true, that the person who's got the most to lose in a negotiation always finds a way to lose? Why do you think that's true? Anybody? I don't want to just start calling on names here, but there's 15 of you in the chat room. I'd love to have somebody kind of just put an idea out there. If it's crazy, we'll tell you.
They feel the most helpless in the negotiation, maybe?
Well, sometimes they feel the most helpless, for sure. Any other ideas? You're going in the exact right direction. Here's the deal. You know, there's this image that I like of the elephant and the rider. And the rider, that little stick figure on top of this big old elephant, is what we would consider the part of our brain, which is kind of the conscious logic center of our brain. And the big elephant is the emotional center of our brain. And what happens is this: when we're emotionally charged up, when we're afraid, when we are emotionally, triggered in any way, it doesn't have to just be fear. But when our emotions get cranked up, what happens is our logic center turns off. It's part of the self-preservation aspect of the way your brain was designed, so that when you're in emotionally charged moments, typically dangerous moments, that you don't overthink them, that you take action quickly so that you get out of danger. And what happens is when people are experiencing heightened emotions, their logic brain just shuts down. And so you think about this image of this little stick figure as the logical brain who's controlling this elephant most of the time. He's steering the elephant's going where he wants it to go and all that stuff. But trust me, if the elephant gets spooked, that rider is not strong enough to contain him. And what happens is, in a negotiation, the person who's got the most to lose is the most afraid. And the person who's the most afraid is acting out of emotion and not out of logic. And in negotiations, that means that you're going to be outmaneuvered because you're not thinking clearly, right? And so rule number one is, as we said it before, be committed to the process, but don't get emotionally committed to the outcome, right? Whatever is going to happen is going to happen. We're going to commit to the process. So here's what this process looks like. Let's talk a little bit about the process of how we handle multiple offers, because guys, you right now are in a powder keg market in your market area of multiples. And I think best practice around multiple offers is to know that if we've done a good job of marketing and generating interest and generating urgency, we should probably expect multiple offers. That's what we're aiming for. Because once we light that fuse, it's the process of the market competing against each other that's going to drive the best offer up that can come out of the buyer pool that exists. And so if we're expecting multiple offers, which we hope to, we need to have a game plan. We need to discuss with our sellers beforehand what will happen when these come. If they come, what's our plan? Because we need to know what we're going to do. I can tell you, having sat on ethics committees and different boards through the years, one of the biggest places that code of ethics charges get made from one agent to another is, how was I treated in a multiple offer situation? If you feel like you were treated poorly or inappropriately, it's going to sometimes lead to an ethics charge. And maybe you were in the right and maybe you weren't in the right. But the point of the matter is that you have to have a plan ahead of time. And I think that, my experience with your market center, having been in it for not a long time, is you're really pretty good at this. I think you guys have some processes in-house of how are we going to handle these, right? And what would be the role of the listing agent, especially if some of those offers are even theirs, right? How are we going to handle those so that it's always above board, it's always transparent, it's always done with pure integrity? And I think you guys do that pretty well. In fact, I think you guys do that very well. That said, we got to have a plan ahead of time. Second thing we need to do is, I think it's good practice sometimes to just kind of have one set of rules that you can set out to everyone in terms of what the bidding window, how long that's going to stay open, and at what point we're going to close that window, and that this is your timeline to submit kind of a final and best offer by a specific deadline, and then adhere to it, right? Again, places where I've seen ethics charges come is when we had a final and best deadline for 2:00 on Tuesday, and we still accepted another offer at 3:00 on Tuesday. That would be a code of ethics violation, because according to the code, you're not treating people fairly. You're not living up to your word, right? So I think it is best practice, though, to kind of have a timeline. If you think about the real estate market being very auction-like, think about bidding on eBay. eBay auctions don't stay open forever. The bidding is going to go until a certain period of time, and then it closes. And so you have a time frame to take your action in. I think that's best practice, right? Let everyone know ahead of time how and when the seller is going to respond. Nothing gets people crazier than to submit an offer and then have the listing agent go, radio silent. Nothing makes people crazier as a listing agent than to have an offer on the table and have your sellers go radio silent. It just makes everybody nuts. And so what we've got to do is we've got to have a strategy with our sellers right out of the gate. When we get offers, what is the time frame? How will we get these reviewed? What's the period of time that we can expect to go back to the buyers and include them in? Because what I know is that people managing their own anxiety, buyers can tolerate waiting a certain period of time as long as they understand how long and they understand why. Think about, when I was a new dad and my daughter, who's now 26, but when she was a little peanut, she used to get these crazy wicked fevers. And like she would start out, if she had a fever, at about 103, and about 80% of the time on the digital scanner, it would go to out of range. And so that's really scary the first few times that happens. And it always happens at night. No kid ever gets a fever during business day hours. And what ended up happening is I'd call the doctor at 2 a.m. and I was panicked. And so if the service gave me some guidelines in terms of how quickly I should expect a return call and what I should do if it didn't happen in that time frame, then I felt more in control. And so let everybody know what the plan is going to be. Have a plan with your sellers. Anything else that people would throw into the mix here about best practice for how you choose to handle multiple offers when you get them? There's a lot of them going on in your market right now, that's for sure. Another place we're going to have strategies for lowball offers, because I think a lot of times lowball offers really get us triggered. And the thing that I said is we've got to present all offers. We can't act as a filter unless, like my banks did sometimes, if the seller sends a threshold and you put it in the agent's notes that says unless the offer exceeds this certain threshold, authorizing my agent not to present it, but that's a seller's prerogative. But everything else we've got to present without judgment. And so we got to recognize that a lowball offer is actually an invitation to negotiate. And our job is to keep that negotiation moving forward. There is a belief in some corners of negotiating that what you try to do in the beginning is to drop what we call a low anchor, right? You try to drop a lowball number. And sometimes in some business sectors, the model would suggest that if somebody's asking for $1, you start at 65 cents, 65%, and you drop this really low anchor to see how far off of their asking price you can pull them down to you. And then based on that, you move up, and then you move up and you come to a meeting of the minds. But sometimes a lowball offer, which is an invitation to start a conversation, it's not designed typically to offend. It's a tactic. And so, look, what we have to do is not get triggered by it. We recognize that it's an opportunity to keep the conversation going. And so we remain upbeat, we remain appreciative, we remain respectful. And what we do is we present the offer to our sellers. We don't become emotionally triggered, but we hold our ground, right? Because if the tactic is to drop this really low anchor to pull us closer to them, then what we need to do is we just need to politely not move. Now, I'm not a fan, and you'll see in another slide or two, I'm not a fan of countering by not countering, saying, I reject this offer outright, or I've got a counter offer. It's full price and go to hell if you don't want to be serious, right? I hear that happen way too much. That's allowing our emotions. That's the elephant talking. We've got to be the rider. We've got to manage that, right? What we've got to do is we've got to hold our ground, but we've got to keep the conversation going. And so what I do believe in is a counteroffer that gives a tiny little bit of movement, but expects you to move closer to me. You drop a low anchor, I'm going to drop a high anchor, and I'm expecting you to move forward. And if you don't, then there's a really good chance that this isn't going to come together. But I'm not going to take the bait, and I'm not going to get emotionally triggered, right? Hold your ground. I am going to look for places of commonality in this offer that we can start to build on and hope that price comes together. So here's the mechanism. And we probably mostly know this, right? And for those of you who've been doing this for a long time, you know how this game works. For those who are newer, we'll review it real quick. The buyer typically makes the first move. Now, I'm going to tell you, they don't always have to make the first move. There have been many times where agents that I've coached have had buyers kind of lingering around. They're coming back a second time and a third time, and they're bringing their decorator, and they're bringing their mama, and they're bringing their builder. And at some point, there's no offer coming. There's nothing that precludes the seller from making the first move and initiating the offer. And for the seller agent to call the buyer agent and say, look, you've been here 4 times. It seems like you've got some interest in this property. Here's what we propose. We're going to make an offer for you to comment on. And this is the asking price, but we'll discount it by a little bit for you. And here's what we would be willing to accept. And here's the terms we would accept. And then the seller starts that conversation. That does happen sometimes. And I think it's a really good strategy because many times what will happen is either you've smoked that buyer out of the weeds, either they're going to put up or they're going to leave, and you know where they stand. But I have seen offers come together where the seller initiated the move. But typically a move is made, someone initiates an offer, and then there's a response that needs to be made. And again, we said before, kind of let the buyers know how and when they can expect a response so that they're not getting emotionally jacked up, that their elephant isn't taking control of this conversation. And that the responses they can make would be they can accept the offer straight out. And they say, hey, this is great. I love everything about this. We're just going to sign it. We're going to send it to the attorney for attorney review in New Jersey, and we're going to start the contract to close process. That happens infrequently, but it happens. It happens more in a multiple bid situation where you've got final and best and you pick one of them, right? Or what's more common is a counteroffer which is made, which says, I reject this offer. However, now I'm going to be the offeror, and I'm going to present an offer to you, and you tell me what you think. And we put a different price and maybe different terms, and we let the buyer counter back and forth, and there can be back and forth, and hopefully we come to a meeting of the minds there. The third approach, which is all too common in this market, or in any market really, and I think it's a sign, quite honestly, it really is a sign of rookie negotiation skills in my estimation. Countering by not countering. Sometimes people think that's a technique and a tactic, but most seasoned negotiators, most skilled negotiators, people who do that for a living will tell you that if your process stops the communication, then you've lost it. And so to counter by saying, I'm not going to respond, come back again when you're serious, 2 things happen. A, communication stops, which is never working in your favor. And B, what you've done now is you've triggered the elephant on the other side. And now they're emotionally responded, they're emotionally jacked up. And the predictability of their next move is going to be in question. And you've lost control of the process. And so I understand why sometimes people think that that's a good thing to do, that it's a show of strength. more often than not, it's not the approach that gets you to a positive place, right? So while I'm never going to say never, never, never do that, I'm going to say try to avoid doing that as often as you can, right? It's better. And I've seen sometimes, I'll give you an example of one listing that I had a number of years ago with a guy who was trying to sell his condo. He could really kind of, we had it on for $299. He could go to $295. The margins are really tight. Anything less than $295, he was going to bring cash to the closing. And while he could, he didn't want to. And if he had to bring too much cash to the closing, he was going to keep it. Well, the first offer came in on a $299 listing at $210. You talk about dropping a low anchor. And this guy was furious. And I said, look, I don't care what his first offer is. What I want to see is what does he do when we respond? So we went from $2,999 or $299.9, whatever it was. We came down $500. And we said, look, we're going to show you some good faith that we want to keep this conversation open. So we're willing to come down $500. However, we expect you're going to take a much bigger step closer to us, or we're not really sure that this is going to come together. So they went from 210 to 240, and we came down from the first 500. We came down another 750, and they went from 240 to 260, and we eventually landed at 295. But it took a lot of steps to get there, right? And so we would have never gotten there if we just told them to go scratch, right? You've got to keep the conversation moving, which leads us to rule number 2. Don't be so tied to the outcome that you think you want that you're not open to a better option when one emerges. This comes, again, a lot of these rules come from the work of Chris Voss, who I've talked about in other classes. He's the former FBI lead hostage negotiator for the FBI for over 10 years. International kidnapping, he was the guy who was talking you out of that situation. Bank robbery goes bad and you're locked up in the vault. This is Chris and his team talking you out, getting you out. And what Chris says is we too many times go in with a predetermined belief in terms of what we want to get out of the negotiation. And we hold too rigidly to that. Because what he says is, and I think he's right, the truth of the matter is that the parties don't put all their cards on the table in the beginning of the negotiation. Would you agree with that? When you start a negotiation, does all the parties put all of their information out on the table, or do they keep some of it a little bit closer to the vest? What's your experience been on that?
The latter.
Sure. And why, Carissa, do they keep some of that information private?
Well, if they don't have to share it, why would they? They might be able to.
Well,
then this way they've got something else to negotiate with later.
What information do they choose to keep private, do you think? What kind of information?
I don't know.
Information that's important. Information that would compromise their ability to negotiate. Would you agree? And so because the most important information isn't on the table, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Hello.
Hello. Go ahead, Deb.
Well, I think she's on a call.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Because the most important information isn't on the table in the beginning of the negotiation, the information that's going to have the most influence on how this negotiation goes, because I don't know that yet, once it gets revealed, there could be a better option out there for me. And if I am too rigid in trying to force my agenda, I'm going to not be able to pivot and make an even better option happen. We've got to stay loose a little bit on this, right? And so one of the questions you got to think about is, what do I not know about the buyer and their motivation that if I did know about it, would really make my response to them easier? What we're trying to do is find a win for everybody. And so help me understand, Mr. Miss buyer's agent, help me understand your buyers a little bit. You know, I've got your offer. Tell me a little bit about them. Tell me more about what's important to them in the purchase of the home. Why do I care about what matters to the other side? Because if I know what matters to them and I keep asking that question, tell me what's most important to them, and then what else? And then what else? And I find that what's important to them is that they get this home, but they get it, you know, on a price that they can afford because they want to do some other things with improvements later, that they get it on terms that they got to get in by a certain date because their child has to register for school, whatever it is. When I find out what matters to them, then I'm in control of what I'm willing to give them and what I'm not willing to give them to make sure that I get what I want. When you know what matters to the other side, you get to be in control of making sure that you give them only the things that you're willing to leverage the outcome that you want, right? And so it's really important to ask. That's the point here. Ask those questions. When you get an offer, before you present it, I think it's really a great idea to call the buyer's agent and ask these kinds of questions. What's important for them? I'm going to present this offer, and we're going to present it in good light. But tell me what's the most important thing, and what else, and what else, and what else, so that then when we come back and we can counter in a way that gives them something to keep them engaged, but doesn't give them everything, because I got to make sure that I get what I want to, right? And price and terms are part of that equation, but I got to probably have some chips in the bank here so that when we get to things like inspection issues and things like that, that I've got some leverage still, right? I may give you one of the items on your wish list if you treat me the way I want to in inspections, right? So I got to know what matters. The goal here is this. You want to try to land this plane in as few steps as possible. And I told you about that offer, a $299 listing, it came in at $210. It probably took us about 8 steps back and forth to come to a meeting of the minds where we agreed at $295. And what happens then is every time we go back and forth and there's a concession made and the buyer comes up and the seller comes down and back and forth, people start to get a little agitated, right? The goal is to try to come to a meeting of the mind and land this plane as quickly in as few steps as you can so that people are not stressed with each other yet, right? I've talked about this in the Win with Buyers class. I view this big emotional piggy bank here, this piggy bank of goodwill. In the beginning of a negotiation, the buyers and the sellers still like each other. And every time that somebody has to give something up, then there's a withdrawal from that piggy bank. And we got to make sure there's enough goodwill in the bank to not just get to a meeting of the minds, but to get through all the contingencies and all of the inspection issues and all of the potential missed deadlines, that the buyers and sellers still have enough of a relationship to tolerate that, or else the deal falls apart. And one of the places that we set ourselves up for failure is we allow it to take too many steps in the early negotiations and we break the bank. Poor little piggy. So managing risk is another aspect of what great negotiators do for their sellers. What do we think about? Well, what we're saying is they protect their clients by anticipating all the places where a deal could fall down, and they protect them from it. So let's talk about a few of them. But first, we'll talk about rule number 3 in negotiations. Never give anything away without seeing to it that you get something back of equal or greater value, right? That's rule number 3. And so in terms of managing risk for our sellers, where are the places that things could fall apart? Well, let's look at a few of them. Price and appraisal. If I get into a great multiple bid situation and I get a really great price and I really don't know if it's going to appraise anymore, there's a risk there. And what's the risk? The risk is that the lender will not give the buyer all of the money that they need. And so what would you want to see in a contract to mitigate that level of risk for your seller? Anybody have an idea of what you would want to see in the contract that would make the seller feel good enough that if the house doesn't appraise, they shouldn't worry about it?
An appraisal floor.
What's that? Laura, go ahead. Say that again.
An appraisal floor. Like
an appraisal floor, right? As long as it appraises to this number, we're good, right? And if you don't have that in the contract, there's just some risk there if you accept a higher offer and appraisal is an issue. How about this? Home conditions and inspection issues, right? We may have a house that is just older. And while things are working, they're at the back end of their serviceable life. And at some point they may fail. And to some degree, that risk could be mitigated by a home warranty to some degree. But what would be other things that if you had a house that you had some concerns that the inspection may uncover things that could be problematic, what would you want to see in the contract to protect your sellers? Anybody? What we tend to do is use these really vague statements like, you know, we'll take this offer, but don't be nickel and diming my sellers during inspection. And the buyer's agent agrees, oh, we're not going to nickel and dime. We're only going to look at structural and, you know, environmental, and nobody's going to nickel and dime. Well, what the heck does nickel and dime really mean? I mean, what we need to do is we need to have clarity. And we need to have real dollar thresholds that say things like, no inspection issue will be requested unless the cost to mitigate exceeds, pick a number, $500, $1,000, that the total potential exposure on inspection, structural and environmental issues will not exceed $2,000 in total. Whatever it is that can really put some clarity around what's the level of risk for the seller if I take this offer is an important thing that we want to see in these contracts if we've got concerns around potential inspection issues. Contingencies, right? Home sale contingencies, these are really hard to do right now. But we want to make sure that we have clarity around those. What does that really mean, right? How about this, the financing type? Why would one financing type versus another financing type create more risk for a seller? Well, anybody want to jump in on that? We don't have any lenders on the call, I don't think, right now.
Well, FHA.
Right.
Had somebody? What was that? Clarissa, was that you?
FHA, veterans.
Yeah.
Okay, Felicia. And so what are the different requirements that those kinds of loans could have that maybe more conventional financing might not have?
Well, the home inspections are a bit more rigid.
Right, for sure. And so what we would want to see is that the type of financing that the person is proposing is going to be something that we believe is going to fit well for the type of product that we've got. Because if you have a loan type where the bank is more on the hook, and that's really what it comes down to, the more the bank owns, the more exposed the bank is. And so on an 80-20 loan, they're pretty comfortable with that level of risk. But once the bank is putting more money in, they're going to require that the house be in better condition, because if there's a problem, it's their asset that's damaged, right? If there's a lawsuit, it's their asset that's used as collateral, or at least the asset that they've got a greater stake in than the current homeowner does, right? So what's the financing type? That's important. Things like unrealistic deadlines, right? Is it really plausible to get these things met in the time frame that you're talking about? We want to make sure that they're okay. Low amounts in escrow, we talked about that earlier. We want to make sure that there's enough in escrow that if the buyer flakes out, that I've got enough to protect me. I don't want just $5,000 in escrow and then have to come and sue you for the rest of the damages if you flake out. I want to make sure that you're putting enough in there that if there's damages, I can get what I need without having to take you to court. So I may take a look at the total amount of money that is coming from the buyer in the transaction. And if it's a low amount, if it's an FHA loan and they're getting maybe 3% down, I may want all 3% in escrow at the beginning of the deal to protect me, right? Just something you want to think about. Things like including personal property. We talked about that before. Keep those separate bills of sale. Get those out of the sales contract. What else are potential places where there's risk for your sellers? Anything else that you can think of that you would want to try to make sure is mitigated in the way that that buyer's contract is structured? And the idea is this: if you get a contract that comes in and it's got some of these concerns in your counteroffers, this is where you want to communicate back how you want the buyer to mitigate that risk for you. I want to see an appraisal floor in this contract, or else we may not go forward with it. I want to see some limits around home inspections, or we may not go forward with it, right? Be clear about what it is that you're asking for. Quick word about attorney review real fast, and I think most of us get it, but the idea is that the 3-day rule that we think about for attorney review, I still find some agents, and many who've been in the business for a long time, who believe that once the contract goes to the attorney, that the attorneys have 3 days to solve whatever they're going to do and come out of attorney review. That is not true at all. What the attorney review rule says is that once the contract is executed and fully binding, which means properly executed and in the possession of the parties, and the buyer or the buyer's agent has a copy, the seller or the seller's agent as their representative has a copy of it. Once that contract's in everybody's hand, the clock starts running. And because we think about attorney review as a cooling off period, you got 3 business days to get it to a lawyer who is an agent of the court. And if they want to make any edits, they have 3 days to begin that editorial process. If 3 days come and go and they haven't made any edits, then the contract stands the way that we wrote it. That's what attorney review is, right? So has nothing to do with how long the process lasts once the attorneys have it. Has everything to do with how much time do you have to get it started. And that applies in short sales as well. I've seen sometimes where a buyer submits an offer and a seller takes the offer and turns it over to the bank, and no one sends it to the attorney for review until the bank decides whether they're going to accept it. Well, once the bank decides, and it could be months and months and months, then what happens is now that contract has been accepted. It's a fully binding contract when it's signed in the possession of the parties. It's the contingency for the short sale has been met, and now we bring it to an attorney to review it, and the attorney looks and says, wait a second, this contract was signed 6 months ago. You had 3 days to bring this to me. That window closed 6 months ago, so I can't really do anything about the change in this contract now. Oh, and by the way, you wrote in a home inspection clause that said after the attorney review period closed, you would have 10 days to inspect it. Well, the attorney review period closed 6 months ago, and the inspection period closed 10 days after that. So now you not only don't have an opportunity for me to review this contract anymore, your ability to inspect it has been waived because you didn't follow the timelines. Don't do that. Get it to an attorney. Let the attorneys stop the clock, which is what they'll do. They'll stop the clock, and they will write the language that says that nothing else happens until the bank decides, and then the timelines start up again. But don't forego getting it to the attorney, right? I just want to drive that home. I have seen in the past 6 months 2 or 3 buyers who chose not to have their contract reviewed in a short sale environment, and it ended badly, right? Now, remember that the first step in attorney review is that the attorney writes a letter that says, as a representative of the court and a representative of this party, I hereby cancel this contract. Now the contract is gone. You had a binding contract, now you got feathers. And so you want to reconstruct it and get to a meeting of the minds as quickly as possible, because bad things can happen when that contract is dead. People can walk away, no harm, no foul. New deals can come in that look better. You want to use a real estate attorney, preferably someone who's on your preferred attorney list, and I believe you have one of those, who knows what that contract says, knows what edits they want to make, doesn't need to read it from beginning to end. If you allow your sellers to have their cousin Brian, who's a trial lawyer, represent them free of charge, and he's never read the standard contract of sale, he's going to have to read the whole thing, and that takes too long. And furthermore, he's going to read it, and he's going to want to make too many complicated changes in it, and it's going to take too long, and the deal's going to come undone. So pick your attorneys carefully. Guide your sellers into using your attorneys. Give multiple choices. Don't run the risk of being sued because you didn't give people choice. They've got to do their diligence, but try to control that process as much as you can. And then once you've got that done, now let's get into command and let's update command, right? We've got that offer in command as a listing side offer. And as it moves through the process, now it goes into contract accepted, and now we kind of move this process all the way through, initiating the contract to close checklist, which is what we're going to talk about on Thursday. But go back in and update command, right? So that's where we're going to park it. We're on an hour on the dot today. Any ahas, any questions about anything we talk about, any light bulb moments or things that you're thinking about differently or will do differently in your practice as a result of the conversation today? You know I'm always going to ask for a couple of ahas, so be prepared. Anybody? There's no ahas today. I find that hard to believe.
Well, I haven't been there yet, so this was all aha for me.
Okay, I love that. You know, everything is aha. I love that. You know, the cool thing about this, though, is, look, this is best practice. This isn't just my opinion. This is just best practice. We've studied this industry for decades and decades and decades, so we know what's the best way to do it, right? And so I really think that a lot of the 3 things that I interjected into this, which probably weren't there before, were those negotiating rules. Rule number 1, sort of, you know, be committed to the process, not to the outcome. Don't let your emotions take control. Don't let the elephant guide this process. You're the rider. You've got to control it. Rule number 2, don't be so committed to what you think you want that as more relevant information comes, you can't get a better offer. I'll give you a quick example, and I think I shared this in Win with Buyers. I had an opportunity to represent one of my daughter's friends in the purchase of a home. And we had thought that the seller would be negotiable on his price. He was not. And what we determined in order to come up to his price is we wanted something from him. Rule number 3, never give something without getting something back of equal or greater value. So in order to come up to full price for these first-time buyers, we got him to include almost a household full of furniture. He was building a new house. Most of his furniture wasn't going to fit, and he included it because he wanted his full price, and he didn't know what he was going to do with his furniture anyway. But for my buyers, to get a kitchen set and a dining room set and 3 bedroom sets and television sets and all that stuff, it was a big win. And it's something that, had we not been open to pivoting when we hit a dead end, we'd have never gotten there, right? So I hope there's some value in this as you think about this. Where we go next now is we've got a contract that's complete. It's out of attorney review. Now we're going to go through the process of kind of shepherding this through. And I'm going to tell you, this is where you earn your keep as a realtor. A lot of people believe the fun part of real estate is showing homes, negotiating contracts, staging homes, putting deals together. All that stuff is the fun part. But getting this thing across the finish line is what separates the winners from the losers in this industry. And it takes skill, and it takes strategy, and it takes real purposeful intention. We're going to talk about how to do that on Thursday, and that's where this course is going to end. All righty?